So welcome back. Some of you were here last week. It's great to see you again. I've just been realizing as I've been working on these three talks, as I go, there's more and more like miscellaneous kind of stuff that's accumulating, and so I'm afraid that the final lecture next week is going to be kind of a junk drawer of everything else I felt like saying or thought was important to say. I'm trying to find some coherence to it. So anyway, but tonight we're going to talk about relativism. And I decided to call this talk Relativism, the Air Our Culture Breathes. And rather than do like an actual summary of the talk last week, which I think would be not a good use of time, I'll just kind of give a highlights reel of that talk just for the sake of introducing this one. So it's kind of a running start to the topic for this evening. But before I do, I'm just going to start in prayer. Our Lord in heaven, we thank you that you are with us. I thank you that you are above and beyond this world in every way, and yet you are intimately connected and at work in your world and in us. We pray that this evening would be fruitful. I pray that you would give me clarity in my mind and in my words. And I pray that each of us would grow in our understanding of who you are and what the particular moment in our culture is like that you've placed us in. I pray that we would be faithful servants, spreading the good news about who you are and what you've done. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so the highlight reel. Last week, in discussing cultural apologetics, I emphasized that it's not a discipline just for intellectuals, for Christian brainiacs, but it's primarily an act of love for people, and that's something we have to remind ourselves of all the time. Apologetics is love expressed by making every effort to understand how other people view life, how other people view the world, how they view God, and perhaps even the reasons why they hold the views they do. And to engage with these questions, I think, is crucial if we're going to understand how our neighbors hear what we have to say. So we talked a lot about how even if I know what I mean, it's not necessarily what my neighbor hears when I speak. And this is one of the reasons why in some of our evangelism, we end up just talking past each other. So if we truly love our neighbors, I think we need to be willing to ask good questions, listen carefully, and ponder how would they, in all their particularity, it's a person, it's not just a category, but how would this particular person be most likely to receive, understand, hear, and accept who Jesus Christ is. And so we also talked about how this love is an aspect of what it means to love the Lord our God with our minds and love our neighbors as ourselves. And so literally, if you forget everything else, if you come away with this, apologetics is about loving our neighbors with our minds, loving God with our minds by engaging with their thoughts. Then that's good. Then this will not have been wasted. I didn't mention this last week, but this is a really important thing that cultural apologetics is not in some sort of new cutting edge approach. It's not at all. It's we can look for our example. The Apostle Paul, in so much of what he does in the book of Acts, what's described in the book of Acts, is doing exactly what I have been describing. If you pay careful attention to Paul's strategy throughout the book of Acts, you'll notice that when he comes to a new city and he wants to speak about Jesus to Jewish people, he goes to the local synagogue and always starts by speaking about the Hebrew Scriptures. His goal, in a similar way to Matthew's gospel, is to convince Jews that Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of the Bible that they already have. It's the fulfillment of their own scriptures. And so Paul knows the Hebrew scriptures. The Jewish people in that community know the Hebrew Scriptures, and it's an obvious place to start because it's a common understanding and it's a common authority. But my point is that when Paul goes into a Gentile setting, he does not start by referring to the Jewish Scriptures, but by some other reference point that his listeners would understand. And a good example of this is Acts 17, where he addresses the Athenians by his very brief, it's very brief address, but in Acts 17, he's addressing this group of Athenians, and it becomes clear that he says that he's spent some time walking around Athens, observing some of the pagan religious practices of the city. He's also taken the time to familiarize himself with some of their poetry. He quotes one of their a Greek poet to a bunch of Greeks. And he starts by acknowledging that they are very religious and commenting on the fact that there are shrines and statues and temples everywhere you go, even shrines to an unknown God. And this is where he chooses to challenge them by saying, you worship what you do not know. And yet I'm coming to tell you about a God that I do know, who has revealed himself in Jesus Christ. It's a fascinating kind of way of communicating to people that don't share his ethnic heritage, don't share his religious commitments at all, and yet he's engaging enough with Greek culture, the Hellenistic culture of the time, as a Jew, that he can communicate to them in a way that actually might have made some sense. It's a worthy thought experiment to imagine what would have happened if Paul had stood up before the Athenians and just started preaching from Deuteronomy or from Isaiah. Probably not a lot would have happened in Athens, and at best it would have been sort of like, I think you took a wrong turn, the synagogue's down there, like go talk to your people, right? But that's not what he does. So he's very pragmatic, and he's thinking about how do these people view the world, and where should I start, right? There's not a one-size-fits-all way of communicating. So, also, last time we talked about presuppositions. We talked about this as sort of a complicating factor, that there are obstacles to belief in our culture. There are obstacles to belief in people's hearts. There are not necessarily well understood or articulated arguments, but they're unexamined assumptions. Beliefs that seem so obviously true that they don't have to be proven or defended or maybe even articulated very well. This isn't the same for everybody. Some people have very, very articulate reasons for rejecting the Christian faith, but a lot of times there are assumptions that aren't really articulated at all. So some of the ones we talked about last week were religion is something that early human societies invented. That's something that maybe people don't think about very much, but just sort of assume is the case. Everyone has the right to define their own identity and to define their own spirituality. That is something that is that sort of belief in human autonomy, that we all have the right to just define our lives however we want to. That is an absolute assumption that is not actually based on much of anything, really. And yet it's just assumed to be true. It doesn't have to be stated. So there are many more, but I'll just move on. So these are sometimes called presuppositions, which are sort of quietly held ideas that are undefended but actually function as a foundation. Presuppositions are foundational ideas, sort of a starting place. You don't actually defend it, but you build everything else on it. Everyone to some degree has presuppositions. People of faith have to build their faith on eventually something that you can't absolutely prove and explain. This is just part of what it is. But so this is what I mean by the air we breathe. This is the air we breathe. That metaphor captures something about cultural ideas, because if you think about air, it's invisible, you can't see it, you're taking it into yourself all the time. If all goes well, you don't think about it, right? You only think about air when you can't get enough of it, or when something's wrong, or when if you're in LA or something, then you can see the air and it's not. Yeah. But but yeah, you're just unconscious taking in all the time. Some of the most entrenched obstacles to belief today are like this. They may be the result of philosophers and intellectuals from 100 years ago or 200 years ago, and these ideas have trickled down through generations and exist as unexamined assumptions in the minds of people today. And this is just one of the ways in which ideas function in the world. Someone who's a very intellectual person might have written some treatise on it, and it's sort of accepted culturally among academia, and then maybe in 100 years, it becomes part of the fabric of how ordinary people think. So, all that's kind of a preamble. This evening, I want to talk about one of those ideas, which in America today, and maybe just in the West in general, it's so widespread that we're just going to spend the rest of the evening talking about it. We could spend much longer than that. Among secular, non-Christian people, it's a totally commonplace assumption, and it's so pervasive, it's so like the air we breathe, that many Christians instinctively think in the same way, too. So I'm not just talking about, like, we are Christians over here, and then the culture is over there. We're also plunked in the middle of the culture. We are actually, despite everything we do to try to remain faithful to God and know our Bibles and go to church and all this stuff, which is good, we're also breathing the same air, right? We're not, we don't stand apart from culture. Put simply, it's the idea that there is no one religious tradition that can claim to have the truth. This is relativism I'm talking about. There's no one religious tradition that can claim to have the truth. This is because there is no one truth. Even if there was, one person or one group of people could not claim exclusive access to it. Instead, there are multiple truths, and whatever a person believes is true for them. Another way of saying this is that all religions and spiritualities are different paths to the same truth. And no one path can claim to be the one true path. So ultimately, it's another way of saying there's no difference between all the paths. Every religion is just one among many ways to God. So that is called, this is just loosely this idea called religious relativism, because it's the belief that religious truth is relative to each believer. Instead of there being a universal truth that would apply to all people equally, there are only relative truths, small truth. You can talk about it as like it's a refusal to accept that truth has a capital T. That there's one truth. There's lots of lowercase t truths in the world. And I want to dig into this a bit, and I want to do it by looking at three features that are common to most worldviews. There's a lot to say about worldviews, and I'm not really going to say much about this at all. Just how people explain the world they see, how they explain what's wrong and what the solution is. Everybody, to some degree, has a worldview of some kind or another. But worldviews tend to make observations about reality, what's out there, what exists. They offer doctrines or beliefs which attempt to explain that reality. They might explain it rightly, they may explain it wrongly. And then also ethical guidance. So it has to do with observed reality, what's out there, what are the facts, doctrines or beliefs about that explain it, and then ethics. What do we do as a result? How do we respond in terms of our decisions in life? And these three are, I think, always present to some degree or another in someone's worldview. In this case, I want to talk about, I'll have specific names for each one of these categories. Pluralism, relativism, which is the main topic for tonight, and then this idea of tolerance. Pluralism, relativism, and tolerance. Pluralism as I'm using the word, is an observation about reality. That's just looking out and describing what we see. Relativism is a doctrine to explain that, a doctrine to how do we understand the pluralistic society we live in. And then tolerance is the ethical response. Tolerance is what we should all do as a result, how we should live. And I have to confess, I'm ripping a lot off from my father, who's done a lot of lecturing on this topic, pluralism, relativism, and tolerance. But years ago, he told me that I have permission to stop asking his permission to do this. And so a lot of this is just kind of stuff that I've absorbed, so to speak, by osmosis, by being in the household and being at L'Abri and just talking about these kinds of things. So there are many ways of approaching the issue of relativism. This is just one way that I think is helpful. And so now we're going to start by backing up a little bit and then to set the groundwork for understanding these three things: pluralism, relativism, and tolerance. People often refer to a historical phenomenon called the Enlightenment. And the term enlightenment refers to a quite dramatic, not immediate, but a dramatic historical shift in thinking in Western Europe and America. And it took place sort of gradually throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. I'm going to speak in very, very general terms here, and I'm not a historian, and I'm not, so just roll with it. And I'm sure there could be, for those of you who know more about this than I do, you could push back, I'm sure. But the Enlightenment is closely linked to the birth of modern science, which had its roots sort of in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The Enlightenment is also connected in some ways in terms of the thinking and approach to faith to the Protestant Reformation. And so there's lots of intellectual things and religious thinking, as well as discoveries in the world of science that are sort of streams, like strings that are interwoven throughout this whole period. But very crudely, I'll put it very crudely, the result of the Enlightenment was that people in the West began to look to reason, the human capacity for rational thought, as the only true source of real knowledge. So the only source of real knowledge is human reason, our own ability to look at the world, to reason, to come to conclusions ourselves. Anything in the world that human beings need to know can be discovered, proven, and understood, and to some degree with technology controlled by reason. So it was a shift to viewing mankind, as the ultimate chooser in the universe, the ultimate being, the ability for human beings to think and reason, really came to the forefront. Questions about the physical world that used to be explained by God's existence or God's presence in the world began to be answered, or so it was thought, by scientific inquiry. So, ironically, the scientific revolution was almost all initiated by people who were believing Christians, and this is the actual foundations for why science is worthwhile. Is a very Christian idea. It's the idea that we live in a universe which is created and ordered. It has actual order to it that can be discovered. It's not a nonsensical universe. It actually has it makes sense because it was made by somebody. And so the foundations for the scientific revolution are completely from within the Christian faith, actually. And yet, there's been obviously a lot that has happened since. But gradually, a shift occurred from science being understood as an excellent way to explore what God has made and how it works, which it is. A shift from that, a way of understanding God's world, to a way of explaining everything such that God could be replaced, such that we don't need God. Who needs a belief in God anymore if we can explain all of the things we used to understand through scientific inquiry? And so the power of science, the explanatory power, in other words, the power that science has to explain what you see, was so great that God was thought to be no longer necessary. Just an interesting way of phrasing it. Does someone cease to exist because we don't think they're necessary? No. But along with that is the development of the idea that religion was something that human beings invented anyway. So religion began to be viewed as a primitive superstition, basically a failure or refusal to accept the undeniable evidence that science has provided. And this is that's just like hitting fast forward on a whole bunch of important historical events and important thinking. But it's the beginning of a long, sad story that certainly continued into this country's history. Many bumps along the way, but this idea that Christianity is basically the enemy of science and exploration. In general, Christianity has to do with refusing to acknowledge facts. In general, it's an anti-intellectual thing. You don't want to think too hard. Sadly, in some expressions of the Christian faith, this criticism is deserved, but it doesn't have to be, and it hasn't always been. We can talk about a few details in that later if we want to, but I'm gonna keep moving on here. But in a relatively short period of time, a couple hundred years, there was this amazing shift from belief in the existence of God as the obvious thing and the burden of proof being on atheism. Do you understand what the burden of proof means? Like basically, like, this is so clearly the truth. If you don't believe it, you have to prove why it's not, right? That's what the burden of proof is. So that's, during the Middle Ages certainly, and into the Renaissance and everything, this was the case. But the shift went entirely in the opposite direction, to the belief that God's non-existence is just obvious. The burden of proof is laid on Christianity. Like, oh yeah, prove that God. Where's the evidence that God exists? Where's the evidence? And this is what I referred to last week as post-Christendom, where that assumption just doesn't exist anymore. That God is there and real, and I can't assume if I bump into someone on the street that we have anything like the same authority to appeal to, anything like the same basic assumptions about reality. Of course, people didn't stop being Christians. There's a lot of, certainly in sort of mainline denominations, there's certainly a drift towards much more sort of liberal understandings of the Bible and theology. And then there's also, in this country particularly, sort of a withdrawal of Orthodox Christians into their own little bubble, because we're the world doesn't like us anymore. We don't belong in the world of public discourse anymore, and that's really a sad thing. But one result of this huge shift that came about after the Enlightenment is that in the minds of people, reality became divided into two separate categories. There's facts, and then there's values. And Francis Schaeffer, one of the founders of L'Abri, the organization I work for, talked about this as an upper story and a lower story. So you imagine it's a house. There's an upper story and a lower story. The lower story is the world of facts. Lower as in right here on Earth. It's the sum total of everything that we can see, taste, and touch, and measure, and quantify. So this is the sphere in which knowledge can be checked and verified, or checked and disproven using the tools of science. And this is the sphere in which knowledge is objective and universal. You can test it, you can show it to be true. The law of gravity can be demonstrated again and again, and it applies to everyone. It's not a matter of opinion or taste. And this is the sphere in which it is actually reasonable to try to persuade someone to agree with you about something, right? You should have my point of view about this fact over here, because we're dealing with very solid realities that are outside of our heads. They're outside of our minds. We can point to them and say, see, I'm right and you're wrong. Look, taste, touch, feel, measure, whatever. It's interesting, and this is something that's more of a conundrum more recently, but people often talk about us living in an age of post-truth, in which there's such a thing as alternative facts and fake news, and even the world of facts is starting to be viewed with through the lenses of relativism, right? So that's, to say the least, distressing. But anyway, that's not where I'm going tonight. So this is the lower story. It's the world of facts. In a post-Enlightenment world, the lower story describes all that can be known, which means all there is. That's the understanding. All that we can really know about is in this lower story. And there was a lecture given by a guy named John Hodges a number of years ago at a conference that I was at. Really interesting. He drew my attention to the way in which the English language is very revealing about the value placed on this lower story as being the real thing. It's the world of facts and science, and it's the material world. And whatever is not part of it is immaterial, right? Which is another word for unimportant and irrelevant, right? If you were to say something is immaterial, it means it has no relevance to the conversation, right? But it's so interesting that actually it's the word...
Whoa, no! Sorry, the mom's coming out with me.
For those of you joining us on our recording, it was a...
Sorry, guys.
Some game.
Sounds like we're having just as much fun, aren't we?
I think they're having a lot of fun.
Having a lot of fun. Anyway, that was awesome. Okay. So yeah, it's sort of telling that the word immaterial has come to mean irrelevant, right? Meaning something that doesn't have matter, right? And even the word matter, referring to the physical stuff of the universe, if something is viewed as insignificant, you say it doesn't matter, right? You have some assumptions about the nature of reality just built into how we use our language. Anyway, in contrast, so that's the lower story, the measurable, hard world of facts. In contrast, the upper story is the world of values and meaning, of faith and belief. And this is the sphere into which all ideas about religion and God have been relegated after the Enlightenment. Everything just gets pushed into this upper story. And this is the sphere in which we talk about spirituality. That's confined to that sphere. It's not the sphere of objective truth with a capital T, but the sphere of subjective experience. In other words, experience that is real for me, but doesn't apply to everybody else necessarily. Not universal realities, but particular opinions and experience. The upper story is viewed as having nothing to do with verifiable or testable facts. So there's no point of contact with the physical realities that science can measure and test. It's just a different kind of truth, a different kind of knowledge. And so because of this, the second story, the upper story, contains truths of private preference, which means that any attempt to persuade others to take my view of things is inappropriate and out of place. It's like last week I was talking about to try to convince somebody to believe in the God of the Bible that I believe in the minds of people today is like trying to convince you that chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla ice cream. It's not that trivial, but something like that's going on. You're not... It just doesn't make sense to try to convince somebody to agree with you about something which is obviously a matter of preference. So, How much I weigh is a matter of fact. What I think about God is a matter of opinion. And those two aspects of who I am are the two completely separated, no connection between them. I'm not going to tell you how much I weigh. And of course, this has huge implications for people of faith, political implications and social implications. It means that faith and any articulation of faith belongs only in the privacy of your head and your homes and not in the public square. It means that the very notion of God revealing himself at a real time to real people at a particular moment in history, in space and time, this is sort of forbidden. This idea doesn't make sense because it would involve the coming together of the world of belief and faith and values with the world of facts. So the whole notion of the incarnation in the Christian faith, that the Lord of the universe who made everything stepped into time and space and became a human being and walked on the same ground that other people were walking on, is just a terrible violation of this, of these two stories. And so this is another way of saying this, is that there's two different kinds of truth and they don't mix. And nature is the locked box. Nothing supernatural can break into this idea of nature. And to be clear, I don't think that the upper and lower story understanding of things is correct. It's not. It's where our culture has come, and it explains a lot of where people are today. But the Christian understanding is very different. The Christian understanding is that reality is made up of things that we can see and things that we cannot see. While we may learn about these two aspects of reality using different means, different tools of perception, they are not two separate realities. There's one reality that includes things we can see and things that we cannot see. God is intimately involved in every aspect of the physical world. He's sustaining it in every moment, in every way we can imagine. He is constantly influencing the world of facts. If he wasn't constantly influencing the world of facts, all existence would come to a halt. The fact that any of us exist, the fact that anything exists, the fact that molecules hold together is because God is willing it to happen and sustaining what he's made in every moment. So it's not the same at all as a deist view of God, which means deism has to do with God made everything and got everything started, wound the clock, so to speak, and then walked away, and now the world is just functioning because of the physical laws that he invented and everything. It just keeps kind of functions of its own accord without God's intervention. That's deism, but that's not the biblical picture of who God is at all. The picture the Bible gives us of God is God making everything and then sustaining everything in every moment, which is gives you a little bit of a different perspective on what miracles are. I think sometimes we talk about miracles as if God created the laws of the universe, set them going, and then walked away. And then every once in a while, a miracle is God sort of breaking into his world and breaking the rules, making, the Red Sea part. And actually, that's not really what a miracle is. God doesn't have to break in to his world. God is sustaining his world in every moment. A miracle is an example of God just choosing to do something differently. God chooses to make the oceans stay where they are most of the time. Anyway, that's a tangent. But the point is that the physical and the visible world and the invisible world are not two different realities. God is intimately involved, even though we cannot see him. But I think a lot of Christians struggle. I certainly struggle sometimes with this assumption that somehow these are two different realities we're talking about. At L'Abri, we're faced with this all the time. We pray that God would sustain L'Abri financially and who would send students, and we don't fundraise. We don't go out of our way to try to make this happen, but we pray that God would provide for our needs. And when people ask us how L'Abri works, people ask us all the time, like, so how do the finances work? That's a weird thing you do. And we have to tell them we ask God to provide for our financial needs. And I have to confess, sometimes that's embarrassing to say, right? Even though I'm a Christian and I believe that God is real, he's there, and he touches the real, tangible world every day, and it's okay to pray for very real, tangible things. It's not stupid to do that. And yet, to say that to somebody who I know will view that as ridiculous is embarrassing. Why? Because I'm breathing the same air, right? I'm like, oh yeah, gosh, it sounds really dumb, right? Even though I know it's true. So, anyway, lest we think that we're just talking about the people over there. Anyway, so the separation of fact from meaning and values is just very real. And it's sort of the bedrock of how many people in the West just think. So now, pluralism and relativism and tolerance, these three categories we were talking about before, this idea of the two stories is an important place to start to understand the rest of these ideas. Pluralism, and it's a word that's used in different ways, but by pluralism, all I mean is that in the modern world, there is a plurality of different viewpoints and beliefs. There's a huge diversity of people and a huge diversity of beliefs and ideas. There's always been a plurality of different viewpoints in the world, but one of the characteristics of the modern world and the results of globalization and everything is that all those differing viewpoints come into contact with each other all the time, every day, in a way that they wouldn't have 200 years ago. If you go to the nearest market basket to my house is in Hudson. If you go there, you're likely to see the odd, I don't know, but the odd evangelical Christian maybe. You're also likely to see a Muslim woman with a head covering, a Hindu family from India. You definitely see a couple of old Irish Catholic folks walking around. Many middle-aged, busy professionals who are spiritual but not religious. And a bunch of teenagers or young 20-year-olds who seem to be in the process of defining and redefining who they are. And this is just pluralism. 150 years ago, all these different kinds of people would not have crossed paths in one place, right? But today it's totally normal. And so pluralism is just a contemporary fact. It's a description of the state of things that no one in their right mind could really dispute. And obviously, pluralism is more clear and obvious in some places more than others. In rural Iowa, it's probably not as obvious as it is in downtown Boston. But in any case, it is a feature of the modern world. And in one sense, it's neither good nor bad. It certainly makes life vibrant and interesting, and I'm glad that I live in I'm glad that I'm exposed to a diversity of different kinds of people every day. But sometimes it is the context for disagreements and conflicts. Pluralism is a reality in Israel and Palestine. Differing views about the significance of holy sites and the ownership of holy sites. And so pluralism it's in a sense a neutral word. It's neither good nor bad. It's a description of what is, and it sometimes can look beautiful and it sometimes can look ugly. Excuse me. Relativism, moving on, I would say is different from pluralism because it's not a simple description of what is. It's not a straightforward fact like pluralism. Rather, it's an interpretation of pluralism. It's a philosophical idea that helps people understand all the differences that they see in the world. It's a belief that helps people to make sense and deal with the plurality of beliefs. This is why I want to refer to it as a doctrine. It's a contemporary doctrine. It's a belief that people hold on to help explain something. There are two very often used illustrations to explain the basic idea of relativism, and I'll talk about them both. Maybe you've heard them before. They're very, I don't know, I've heard them in lots of different contexts, but they're just metaphors or illustrations to explain what relativism is all about. The first one is, there's a mountain, and up on the top of the mountain is God, the truth, whatever. If there's anything universal, it's up there on the top of the mountain. Religious traditions are just paths up that mountain. Different people are on different paths, but they're all headed in the same direction, and they're all headed to the top of the mountain. So the destination for every religious tradition and every spirituality I could invent, the destination is the same. But when you're on a trail, like you are, if you've hiked much in the mountains at all, if you're below the tree line, the trail is all you can see. You can't see the other trails. They're behind the trees. You can't even see the top clearly. You're maybe doing switchbacks around, and all you can see is the trail that you're on. And so the temptation is to say, this trail is the trail. It's the only one, right? And this is used as a metaphor to explain relativism. Say, actually, no. Any religious tradition that claims to be the truth, to have the way, they're really just one path. And they think they're the one way because all they can see is their path. But actually, from above, looking down on this mountain, you can see that all these different trails basically lead to God. The other analogy, which is different, I almost like this one more just because it's weird. I think it's originally a Hindu story. I may be totally wrong about that, but it has an origin that I forget. Anyway, it's that there's a bunch of blind men in the room with an elephant, and so this is a very typical illustration. Each blind man walks up to the elephant and touches some part of the elephant, and they assume that based on what they're touching, they know exactly what it is, right? So someone grabs the trunk and says this is an enormous hose, obviously, or grabs the tail and like, well, it's a rope, and fill in the blank, and because each of these men is blind and they're holding on to one aspect of it, of course it makes sense that they would think that they have the interpretation. They see what this thing is. But actually, it's an elephant. And no one of them can see the whole truth at all. But they all have an aspect of the truth. So, in other words, both of these illustrations are trying to communicate that reality is too big for anyone to really grasp because no one can see the whole elephant. No one can see the mountain as a bird would, looking down. No one should try, therefore, to define the whole thing based on the little part that they see. Instead, everybody needs to realize that despite all of our differing perspectives, there is no ultimate difference between religions. The goal is the same. And to many people, this seems to be just totally self-evident. This is just the obvious truth. What can we say in its favor? I mean, it's a powerful idea. Why is it that so many people find it plausible? I think one reason is that it seems to be very humble. It seems to be a humble approach to all the differences that we see around us. To say that no one can really know and no one has the exclusive truth is a humble thing to say. Practically speaking, I think this is a huge one. Practically speaking, to believe in relativism is by far the easiest and best way to get along and avoid arguments with most of your neighbors most of the time, at least in this part of the world. I think it's very different parts of this country would be pretty different in this regard, but in the sort sort of theologically and politically liberal part of the world in which we live in, to believe in relativism is a great way to get along at cocktail parties and not get into any arguments with anybody. Yeah?
Do you think that people who use the relativism arguments are generally religious people or not religious people?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. I would say, I'm going to get into this a little bit in a few minutes, but I think it's coherent in some ways, or there's more harmony between relativism and some very kind of comfortable westernized versions of Buddhism, which would generally have to do with claiming that the distinctions between one thing and another thing are an illusion, and so it's sort of it syncs with that a little bit better than anything else. But I think it's something that I think it can be held by people that would describe themselves as religious and people that wouldn't. Certainly, a lot of people who have trouble with organized religion. They don't like the idea of organized religion. Maybe they think the church is no good or whatever. But still view themselves as spiritual. You know, I still have a spiritual life, whatever that is. But it's very much self-defined. Certainly, relativism is kind of the underpinning beneath that. The fact that I could invent my own religion, invent my own way of defining God and my way of, that's you can't really do that unless you're assuming that it's all relative, right? But for a lot of religious people, it's a temptation to sort of, and this is true for a lot of Christians, because the climate is so biased towards relativism. It seems much easier to think of my faith as something that works for me. I love it. It's important. It's the most important thing in my life. I love Jesus, but Jesus works for me. For you, something else could work, right? And so I would say it's a risk for anybody, and it's potentially at work anywhere you look. Yeah, but an excellent question. Yeah. Yeah.
Good question. Even though I have particular issues with relativism, but let's follow the analogy of the mountain.
Sure.
If let's say that there are two possible realities, right? There's one true religion, and it's ours, what we hear. So, or the other truth is that actually there are all these multiple paths to the same top.
Yeah.
Why would it matter to us which of the two is true? If we end up at the top anyways, whether there's only one true religion or one true path, or all these other paths, what is the relevance for us here today, basically, that there is one true path?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is, does it matter? Yeah, if there is actually, if that actually is a description of reality, that actually it does not truly matter because every path is a different way to the same truth, I would say it shouldn't matter to us. But I don't think it is reality. I think that actually it's not true to say that every religion is the same and leads to the same place, because I'm going to get a little bit more into this at the end as I critique relativism, some of the things that I think are just really not honest about it. But I'm not sure I'm answering your question or I'm understanding it well.
Not quite. Maybe I didn't express myself well, but because in the end for us, we would end up at that same top. So to that respect, you could say it really doesn't matter. Even if the world was, if the model of relativism were true, why would we care? Again, like I have particular different issues with it. I'm sure, like you said, you're going to critique it. I think the whole notion of relativism makes it impossible to critically think. Period. There's just no possibility to actually think. But I'm really not sure if So yeah, I would say like, why should we care much about whether, well, yeah, which of the two worlds that I presented basically is true?
Well, I mean, in one sense, if we're only thinking about ourselves and our own salvation, then that's a different. It might not matter practically to us very much, but the fact is, we're faced with the question of: are we called to try to convince other people to be Christians or not?
Well, actually, I think that you're probably right.
And then it's an incredibly significant question, because if Jesus truly is the only way to God and the Christian faith really is the only true way of understanding reality, then and the only way to salvation, then I absolutely need to try to convince people to get on my path, right?
The other ones are
Yeah.
dead ends, I guess.
Right. Now, not everybody believes that, and so if you don't believe that, there's absolutely no point in evangelism at all. If someone wants to come over and come to my church and enjoy our expression of faith, that's great, but I'm not going to try to convince them that it's really important that they do. But if I have this idea that Jesus Christ truly is the way, as he explained himself to be, then yeah, it's just loaded with significance in terms of the urgency of trying to convince other people that this is true. Yeah.
Maybe a follow-up question that goes perhaps beyond the scope here. As we have numerous denominations in this country as well as in other countries, if you just add them all up, is there a similar type of path? Do all these Christian denominations eventually are there just parallel paths to the top, or do we have a lot of them that are leading us astray as well?
That's a very good question. That's actually a very that's such a big question. I'm not sure I can deal with it right now in this portion of the talk. I will say that some denominations differ over things that are really essential to the faith, and some differ over things that are completely, I don't think, essential to the faith. So there's a lot to be said there. But I think what I am going to do, if you want to talk a little bit afterwards, we can do that. Sure. And I'm not sure what I'm going to say, but I'm gonna power on with this right now because it may answer some other questions as I go.
Sorry for taking you.
Not at all. No. That's great. It's a great question. It's actually one of the reasons that turns people off of the Christian faith is looking at like they can't even get along with each other. They can't agree about anything, and everybody just looks at the Bible and convinces themselves that it means what they want it to mean. So what's the point? Why bother even consider this, right? So it's a very relevant question. So where was I? So what about a response to this, though? I actually think that it's not the best way of understanding the diversity of beliefs in the world. I said it seems like a humble approach. I think it seems like a humble approach. It looks like a humble view of things. In my view, it really only poses as humility. Because while it claims that all roads lead to the same destination and that the elephant parts really just are part of the same animal, the perspective of the person making this claim is conveniently not mentioned in either of the metaphors. This is one of the classic criticisms of these two illustrations. How in the world can we claim that all roads lead to the same destination unless we alone are hovering above the mountain looking down like a bird and see everything? Everyone else is blind on their trail, but not us. We, the relativists, can see the whole picture, can see the whole mountain. Same with the metaphor of the men and the elephant. How can we tell that none of the blind men are correct in their assessment unless we alone can see perfectly? So while claiming that no one can have universal knowledge of the truth, relativism claims universal knowledge of the truth in a sort of sneaky way, right? In a way that seems very humble. It's in a sense critiquing religious arrogance, but it puts forth quite an arrogant claim, but while seeming humble. It poses, this is the sort of a second point, it poses as very open and inclusive. So wherever you have a strongly held belief, a strongly held doctrine, no matter what it is, whenever there's a doctrine, there's always the possibility of heresy, right? Anything you believe that contradicts that doctrine. So to deny the doctrine of relativism, remember I'm talking about this as a doctrine, to deny the doctrine by claiming that there is one truth that applies to everyone, this is the equivalent of heresy in the context of today's world. The Christian faith is heretical in this way because it commits the sin of being exclusive. Exclusivity of the Christian faith is such a hard thing for people. Sometimes it's a hard thing for me, and I believe in it, right? It's exclusive because it claims that belief in the God of the Bible is correct and disbelief is false. And it claims that there is one way to the Father, Jesus Christ the Son, and that no one comes to the Father except through Jesus. That's about the most exclusive thing that you can say. Nobody comes to the Father. In other words, nobody is saved except through Jesus. Jesus says, I am the way. He doesn't say, I am a way among many. He doesn't say, I am the way if it works for you. He says, I am the way. So there's this terrible either-or kind of foundation to reality that the Christian faith is saying it's either you belong to Jesus or you're lost, and that's the nature of the exclusivity that is so troubling and so abhorrent to people. But again, relativism is posing as being very inclusive and all-embracing. It's just as exclusive as any other belief. It excludes every major world religion. Try telling an Orthodox Jew in Jerusalem that all religions are basically the same. What are they going to say? Go away. How about a devout Muslim in Iran? All religions are basically the same. We should just get along, right? No. Most people in the world believe that religions exclude each other. Relativism can exist in this very comfortable, safe, modern Western society in which nobody really believes anything anyway, and so everything is fine, right? But the claims of relativism are incredibly exclusive when you look at the way in which religion functions in the world, globally. And like I said, it harmonizes probably best with some very kind of westernized American versions of Buddhism because, and this is one of the reasons why in American culture Buddhism is so sort of popular, at least maybe in a superficial way. It's that like, well, there's no ultimate distinctions. What we see around us, the difference between you and me and the tree and the air is an illusion. And people who are really advanced in understanding reality can see through the illusion. And so there's a way in which that obviously synchronizes with relativistic thought. But the fact is, you can't really hold any belief firmly without it contradicting some other belief. It's just reality. Relativism is no different. It just doesn't admit it. So the claim that relativism makes, I think this is, I'm just sort of working here to, various different objections to the idea. Relativism makes a brazen, unreasonable claim on the universe, actually. If we think about really what we're claiming, if we believe this, it claims in essence that whatever I believe is true for me, and nothing real outside my thoughts and feelings can impinge upon that belief. Nothing. What I believe is true for me. Nothing outside my head can impinge on that. Like, really? Since when has reality ever obeyed us in that way? People can only go on believing this way because of that complete separation between facts and beliefs, right? That's the only way it works. Those two stories that are totally separate. We live in a time where it is normal to construct one's own spiritual beliefs. It's a normal thing. The individual has complete autonomy over their beliefs. It's been compared to a salad bar, of religion. You just pick what you want from every religion, things that seem nice, things that seem weird or uncomfortable, who cares? You're not submitting to any authority outside yourself. You're just constructing what works for you and what seems nice to you. Glean from whatever podcast, whatever blog you like online, and it's just a conglomerate of whatever it is you decide to put together, and that's seen as being totally normal, and even good. Not just normal and okay. It's like, this is what you should do. Why submit to someone else's view of reality? But life is full of serious questions. If people are serious enough to ask them, is there a God? What is he, she, or they like? Is there life after death? Does my life now matter at all? What does it mean? What is goodness? What is virtue? There's so many important questions about life that are really significant. Relativism makes the audacious claim that when it comes to these most important questions in life, it's impossible to be wrong in any way that matters. It's impossible to be wrong about the most important things in any way that matters. How can anyone be sure of that? Nobody can be sure of that. People are very foolish to assume that that's the case. So I think relativism it doesn't really stand up to reality. Another assumption that drives many people's faith in relativism is that we can only, and this is a sad thing, I mean, maybe there's some grounds for this, we can only avoid conflict by blurring distinctions, by pretending that differences aren't there, right? Only way to avoid conflict, and this is why I think that, I'm sure many of you have seen the coexist bumper stickers everywhere, coexist, interesting. I mean, you could write like a reflection on what that image is communicating and the assumptions behind it. Because on one level, I'm like, people of different religions should coexist. They shouldn't kill each other. They shouldn't murder each other's children. They should. I believe in the separation of church and state in this country, and that people who are not Christians should be able to live here safely and worship. This is all good. Coexisting, there's nothing wrong with that. But what the image communicates is that you can only coexist if it's all the same. Right? The C is I forget, I can't even picture it right now, but it's basically every religion is incorporated into that one word, which sort of communicates subtly, or not subtly, that the only way to really coexist is if the differences don't matter, if the differences aren't real, if it's all just one word, right? The fact is, that's a religious belief in itself, right? That actually contradicts every one of those religions that's incorporated in that picture. So the distinctiveness of each religion is a danger. What makes us differ from each other, from everybody else, is assumed to be dangerous. I think it's much, much better, much more honest, much more actually respectful of other people to acknowledge and name the real differences. Like, Christian belief is very different from Muslim belief. It is. The idea of who God is very different. The idea of how we come to God and how we're saved, very different. The differences are not an illusion. They're not. They are significant. But we need to name those things and then actually strive to love people across those differences, rather than assume that we can only get along if we pretend we're all the same. And that brings us to tolerance. I'm wrapping up. I know, I'm sorry, I've gone a long time, but tolerance is the contemporary sort of ethic. Pluralism is what we see when we look out in the world. Relativism is the doctrine to understand that. And then what do we do? How do we live? Tolerance is sort of the ethical implication of that. If all beliefs are equally valid, no one has a monopoly on the truth, then we must be tolerant of everyone's beliefs. And this means not just to abstain from killing each other, which is important. It means much more. Tolerance means much more today. It means to respect and show deference for a whole host of beliefs that are not our own, many of which blatantly contradict one another. And this is the case in a much broader sense than just religion. I've been talking about religious relativism here, but tolerance today, I mean, particularly in the university setting, but in a lot of the sort of trickle down attitudes in our culture today. Tolerance today means being prepared to accept that a person's internal feelings outweigh realities that are observable outside their heads. My internal feelings are closer definition of reality than the physical world. To question this is not just to disagree, but is interpreted as hatred and bigotry. So there's a lot. You get into some pretty controversial ground here, but I'm a white guy. What if I identify as a person of color? Are you allowed to say, no, you're not? My feelings are what define reality. And not just for me. If you don't acknowledge that my feelings define reality, you hate me.
Right.
This is not just in the world of political correctness. This is bleeding into every aspect of how, this is ancient history now, but if Donald Trump claims that his inaugurational ceremony was the best attended inauguration ceremony ever, and presents this as an alternative fact, despite the aerial photographs that show it was not very well attended, you're supposed to just get on board with that, because that's what he feels. So tolerance is just really loaded and dangerous. Like, we're expected to actually believe, okay, so whatever you happen to feel is reality, and if I don't get on board with that, then I hate you. The cards are stacked against us. Here, we need to question the whole basis of this. So, as you can see, we're living in a time when relativism is being unleashed, not just in the upper story of religious thoughts, but it's being unleashed in the lower story of facts, too. You have your facts, I have my facts. And my facts will just be more and more reinforced based on whatever social media I tend towards. And we'll be getting further and further away and more polarized from each other. This is just the reality of the world we're living in. That's a bomb to drop. We'll maybe talk about that later. But the problem with tolerance is that it's a totally empty word. Tolerance doesn't mean anything unless you specify what you're tolerating. I think it's G.K. Chesterton. It might have been some other writer, but it's a wonderful quote. To say that a man is tolerant is like saying he is very. Doesn't mean anything. What do you mean you're very? It doesn't mean anything because you haven't said what you're tolerant of. So it's sort of an inconvenient thing, but we've been talking about religious relativism. Along with that comes moral relativism. In other words, I get to decide what's right and wrong for me. This is what's right and wrong for me. That can be right and wrong for you. But relativism gives us no foundation for making distinctions between what is right and what is wrong, what should be tolerated, what should not be tolerated, right? Nobody actually practically thinks everything should be tolerated. Nobody, right? But this belief in tolerance that's unspecified is just totally naive. Nobody can live that way. Nobody should live that way. Most people have an intuitive sense of the intolerable. But without a concrete foundation for morality, which I think God provides, then you have no way of saying what's wrong. You have no way of even explaining your own gut instinct that something is wrong. On what grounds? You just feel that way, but is it really wrong? What if stealing cars works for me? It makes me feel alive. I've never felt so alive as when I rip off a car. Okay, what if it's your car? Are you, whatever. That's sort of a silly example, but there are examples in recent years in the UK. I think it's among Pakistani communities, very, very religiously conservative Muslim communities, in which honor killings are viewed as an authentic expression of the Islamic faith. And actually, it's a politically risky thing for law enforcement officials to question it. What is going on? Well, you're questioning someone's religion. If our doctrine is relativism, what resources do we have to say anything into that? We don't. So the Christian faith calls us to something actually much more difficult than tolerating people. it's, every day it's easy to tolerate someone by completely ignoring them, right? I'm tolerating you. All it means is I'm not attacking you, but that's not the same thing as love. And Christian people are called to love, which is very active and very challenging. It's a call on Christian people, despite the conventional wisdom of today. Loving people, respecting them, treating them with dignity is not the same thing as loving, respecting, and legitimizing their ideas and beliefs. To love people is not the same thing as accepting and legitimizing what they think and believe. We're not called to respect and revere every belief equally. The Bible gives us grounds for being able to say some ideas are lies. It gives us grounds for being able to say some things are just false. Some beliefs do not correspond to reality. But we're called to respect and revere every other human being equally, because every human being is an image bearer of God. We have to respect and revere a human being because of this aspect of their identity. They're made in the image of God, but actually their beliefs and thoughts and ideas are not the foundation of their identity, even if they think they are. And that's a complicated thing. So, love in biblical terms is not something we can only practice if we pretend another person is basically like us. Not at all. Christian love calls us to acknowledge the real differences between us and another person, and then extend the hospitality of God to that person across that divide, sometimes in very costly ways. And I think this is actually, it's just truthful, first of all. It's also a way of honoring someone else and their beliefs. It's actually incredibly condescending to tell somebody else that their belief system is just basically the same as everybody else's. Anyway, that's where I'm going to stop. I'm sorry that I've gone so late, but we have a few minutes. I think we go till 8, is that right?
Yep.
We have a few minutes to chat if you all want to talk anymore. Any questions? Yeah.
I've got just a question about relativism in general. So you mentioned dividing that house into two aspects. You've got the facts, and then you've got sort of the beliefs around those facts. And it seems, just looking at the other side, would a relativist say, would the relativistic point of view say, generally relativism has to do with the upper half of the house.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to do with the lower half of the house, which is more verifiable.
Mm-hmm.
Is that an argument that a relativist view would say? And is there a way of looking at that and saying, and looking at how it does pervade into the facts? Because I think it seems to be more, at least around here, more accepted the idea of relativism with beliefs, whereas facts we kind of look at it and say, well, this is verifiable, this is undefinable.
Yeah.
And if we look at other people from other areas that may bring that relativism into the facts portion and say, hey, wait, those guys are wrong. Those people are wrong. I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's the reason why it's important to understand that these, however you choose to articulate it, but that those two stories, because it's by separating reality into those two categories that we can then still respect facts as being real and important, and also account for just the huge diversity of beliefs that people have that don't correspond with each other, right? And so I think it's definitely, in terms of religious relativism, that's totally a way of coping with that upper story. And just accounting for that and sort of trying to reconcile that, I guess. But you're right, and I think this is something that is just very confusing to me, to lots of people, is when that idea of relativism starts to soak into the lower story, where we thought that at least was clear, right? There isn't going to be disputes over that, right? But of course, that probably has never really been the case. Facts, because human beings are not. One of the lies of the Enlightenment is that rationality and reason are just objective and free from sin. It's not true. Even the world of facts has been corrupted as well. A classic example in the Bible itself. We would like to think, and this is a very Enlightenment way to think, if I just see enough evidence, then I'd be convinced. If I just see the facts laid out and it's proved to me, then I'm a rational person. Of course I would believe. That's just not true. I mean, one of the most stark examples in the Gospels is when Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. And so this is the clearest, up to that point, the clearest demonstration of who he is, that he is the Lord. Nobody can reverse death. The fact that he speaks to Lazarus and Lazarus gets up and walks out of the tomb, that has Yahweh written all over it. Like, this is God. There's no other way to explain this. What's the response that people have at that moment? Some people believe in him and follow him from that day onward. The rest of them try to kill him. That's in the Gospel of John. That's the first time that the religious leaders said, we need to get rid of him. He's too dangerous. We better kill him. What's that about? I mean, there are witnesses that saw it, that went running back to the chief priest to tell them about this. Well, it's been proven. It's been shown. People saw this happen. The guy was dead for 4 days. Jesus waited for 4 days specifically so that everybody would know he was really, really, really dead and not just pretending or something. I don't know, really, 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 really dead. And now I'm going to call him back to life. Well, those two responses are pretty disturbing. I would like to believe that I would say, this is the Lord. Like, yes. It depends on whether you want to submit to him or not. If you don't want to submit to him or not, it doesn't matter how much evidence you have in front of you, you're going to reject it. And you're going to dig in your heels harder. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. The more evidence you see, the more you're going to resist, actually. And so this idea that somehow rationality and reason will conquer all these obstacles and we'll be able to see the truth and be objective in it, it's just never been true. And so, in a sense, it's not too shocking that this idea of relativism has bled into the world of facts, and everybody has their own facts. It gets a lot of press, and it has a lot to do with how polarized our culture is now. But and it's interesting. I read this article once. It was a totally confusing article, but made this one point that I remembered, which is all along sort of liberal people in general are very comfortable with religious relativism, right? It's great. Everybody gets along. But then when those same principles are applied to some of the things that Donald Trump was saying, it's suddenly, because it's being used for political ends of the opposite party, it's suddenly like, whoa, no, you can't do that. It's just really interesting. It's kind of, if everybody can define reality, then unfortunately people you disagree with are going to define reality too. And anyway, that's, I'm not sure if that was like a...
Yeah.
Any other thoughts or questions?
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming.